What if the Soviet Union won WW2 without the help of the U.S.? The Red Banner over Westminster. Chapter 1. The fog rolled off the Thames like a grey shroud, but it could not hide the red banners that now draped Westminster Bridge. Katerina Fedorova pulled her wool coat tighter as she stepped from the official car, her breath forming small clouds in the October chill. 1 year had passed since the Great Liberation, and London still felt like a city holding its breath. Comrade Fedorova. The driver remained at attention beside the black ZIL limousine, its Soviet plates gleaming despite the damp. Shall I wait? No need, Pavel. I'll walk back to the hotel. She shouldered her leather satchel, heavy with notebooks, and her precious Leica camera. The Ministry of Information had given her 3 days to capture the transformation of Britain's capital for Pravda. 3 days to show the world how socialism had bloomed where capitalism had withered. The massive portrait of Stalin gazed down from the Houses of Parliament, his mustache somehow stern even through the morning mist. Where Big Ben had once chimed, a red star now crowned the tower. Katerina had seen similar transformations in Berlin, Vienna, and Paris. But London felt different. The defeat here had been total, swift, and strangely bloodless after the royal family fled to Canada and Churchill died of his heart attack upon hearing of the American decision to remain neutral. Excuse me, miss. The voice was carefully polite, with the crisp accent that marked him as educated class, former educated class. Are you the journalist from Moscow? Katerina turned to see a tall, thin man in a threadbare but clean suit. His face carried the particular pallor of those who had once lived well and now made do with ration books. Sandy hair, blue eyes that held the careful emptiness of survival. I am Katerina Fedorova, correspondent for Pravda. And you are? James Morrison. I'm assigned by the Cultural Ministry to assist with your interviews. He extended a hand that was soft despite everything. A pianist's hand. Former Squadron Leader Morrison, if you're wondering about the accent. Now I help coordinate our re-education programs. The way he said "our" made Katerina study his face more carefully. There was something underneath the compliance, a flicker of something that couldn't quite be called defiance. Good. I'm told you know where to find the success stories. She pulled out her notebook. Workers who've embraced collective ownership. Students thriving under the new curriculum. Former capitalists who've seen the light. Oh yes, James said, and for just a moment his smile seemed almost genuine. I know exactly where to find them. They walked together down Whitehall, past the Soviet administrative buildings that had sprouted in every government office. Red Army soldiers stood at intersections, young men from Georgia and Ukraine who looked as out of place as the Cyrillic signs that now labeled every street. A queue stretched from what had once been Harrods, now the People's Department Store number 7. Tell me about the transformation, Katerina said, falling into the rhythm of an interview. How has life improved for the ordinary British worker? James was quiet for a long moment, watching an old woman in the bread line. Well, he said finally, everyone has work now. The unemployment crisis is completely solved. Technically true, Katerina knew. The labor camps in Scotland were always in need of workers. And the cultural benefits? I understand there are new schools, new programs. Oh yes, very comprehensive. We're teaching a whole generation to think differently about property, about individualism, about the old imperial mentality. His voice carried that careful neutrality of someone who had learned which words were safe. They stopped before the National Gallery, now the Museum of People's Art. Soviet realist paintings hung beside the Turners and Constables, creating jarring juxtapositions of tractors and pastoral English countryside. It's quite a collection now, James said, watching Katerina's face, though some pieces had to be relocated for their own protection. Relocated? To Moscow. The Hermitage, mostly, for safekeeping. Katerina nodded and made a note. Cultural treasures secured for the people. That was the line she was expected to write. But something in James's tone suggested another story entirely. Chapter 2. The morning interviews went exactly as planned. At the Docklands Collective, former shipyard owner Harold Pemberton explained how worker ownership had increased both productivity and personal fulfillment. At the Westminster Re-Education Center, Professor Margaret Thornby discussed how Marxist pedagogy had revolutionized British academia. Each conversation followed the same pattern: careful praise, measured enthusiasm, and eyes that never quite met Katerina's directly. "They're very well rehearsed," she commented to James as they shared lunch at a workers' cafeteria near London Bridge. "Practice makes perfect." James stirred his potato soup, a thin affair that wouldn't have fed a cat properly. "Would you like to see some of our agricultural successes this afternoon? There's a model collective farm in Kent." The train south was nearly empty. Through grimy windows, Katerina watched the English countryside roll past fields that should have been golden with autumn harvest, but seemed somehow diminished, incomplete. Small villages appeared deserted, except for the occasional red flag marking a party office. "Where is everyone?" she asked. "Relocated for efficiency. Smaller communities aren't economically viable under the new system." James kept his voice neutral, but his hands tightened on his briefcase. Better to concentrate agricultural workers in larger, more productive units. The Whitfield Collective occupied what had once been a dozen family farms. The manager, a party official named Kozlov, who spoke no English, gave them a tour through an interpreter while James translated. Modern tractors, scientific farming methods, happy workers singing folk songs as they harvested beets. But Katerina had grown up on a collective farm in Ukraine. She knew the signs: workers who moved too slowly, equipment that gleamed from disuse rather than care, yields that didn't match the manager's enthusiastic numbers. During a moment when Kozlov was distracted, she slipped away from the group. Behind the model barns, she found them. The old farmhouses stood empty, windows broken, roofs caving in. Overgrown gardens showed where families had once tended vegetables and flowers. In one doorway, children's toys lay scattered in the weeds: a wooden horse, a doll with half its hair missing. The Whitfields lived there for 300 years. James had followed her, his official composure finally cracking. 5 generations of the same family. They knew every inch of this soil, every season's rhythm. Gone to Siberia in February for economic sabotage. What was their crime?
They couldn't meet the grain quotas. Turns out, you can't just take men who've farmed the same land for centuries and expect them to be happy as factory workers in Vladivostok. His voice was bitter now, all pretense abandoned. "But I'm not supposed to know that."
Katerina stared at the abandoned homes, thinking of her own family's village, relocated during collectivization when she was a child. She had written about that too, calling it progress, modernization, the march of history. But she remembered the tears in her grandmother's eyes when they loaded the cart for the last time. How many villages? In this county? Maybe 30. Across Britain? He shrugged helplessly. Thousands. The official number is classified, but I process the cultural re-education assignments. I see the names, the families broken up for distribution across the Soviet Union. That evening, back in London, James led her down a different path. Not to the official cultural sites or model housing blocks, but through bombed-out neighborhoods that hadn't been rebuilt. Past shops with their windows still boarded from the war. Where are we going?
St. Bartholomew's, what's left of it.
The church had taken a direct hit during the final bombing. Its spire collapsed and nave opened to the sky. But someone had cleared the rubble and created a small shrine among the ruins. Photographs, letters, personal items, arranged with careful reverence. "We're not supposed to be here," James said, checking the darkened street. "But people come anyway, to remember." In the shadows of broken stone, Katerina saw them. faces in photographs, letters from families separated by deportation, children's drawings of homes that no longer existed. A wedding photograph of a young couple, both marked with black ribbons. A list of names in careful handwriting, the disappeared, the relocated, the ones who had volunteered for service in Siberian labor camps. Mrs. Chen keeps the records. James touched a small notebook hidden beneath some stones. Her husband was a bank manager before. Now she cleans floors at the ministry building and writes down every name she can remember, every family torn apart. Why are you showing me this? James looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something she hadn't expected. Hope. Fragile, but real. Because you're the first journalist from Moscow who's asked real questions. The others just write down what they're told and go home. But you see things. You ask about the empty villages. He paused. And because something's coming. The Americans are finally stirring. There are rumors of supply drops, resistance networks, coordination across occupied Europe. Maybe the world isn't ready to let this be permanent. Katerina touched her notebook, heavy with official interviews and approved quotes. But in her mind, she was writing different words entirely. Chapter 3. The knock on her hotel room door came at 3 in the morning. Katerina had been expecting it since returning from the ruins of St. Bartholomew's. She opened the door to find 2 men in dark coats, NKVD, unmistakably, despite their civilian clothes. Comrade Fedorova? The older one spoke with a Georgian accent. Colonel Berzin, Internal Security. We need to discuss your research methods. They sat in her hotel room's small chairs while she remained standing, a position that gave her the illusion of control. The colonel studied her notes, spread across the table in careful disarray. Your interviews seem quite thorough. Model citizens expressing proper gratitude for liberation. He looked up with eyes that held no warmth. Though we understand you've been exploring beyond your assigned itinerary, I wanted to capture the complete picture, the transformation of both urban and rural areas. With the assistance of James Morrison, the younger man spoke for the first time. A former enemy pilot whose loyalty remains questionable. Katerina's heart hammered, but her voice remained steady. He was assigned by the Cultural Ministry. I assumed he had been properly vetted. Everyone is properly vetted, comrade, but some require ongoing observation. Colonel Berzin closed her notebook with a soft snap. We trust your article will reflect the appropriate perspective. Soviet readers are eager to hear of Britain's successful socialist transformation. After they left, Katerina sat in the darkness until dawn, staring at her notebooks and thinking of the choice before her. She could write the expected peace-triumphant socialism, grateful British workers, the march of progress. It would advance her career, keep her safe, maintain the narrative that kept millions believing in their sacrifices. Or she could write the truth. The final morning brought James to her hotel lobby, pale but composed. They had coffee in silence, both understanding that their conversation might be monitored. I have what I need for the article, she said finally. I'm sure it will be exactly what Moscow expects. But as he stood to leave, he pressed something into her palm, a small piece of paper with an address written in careful handwriting. In case you ever want to send postcards to friends in Stockholm, he said. They're always interested in hearing from travelers. Katerina spent that afternoon walking through London one final time, seeing it with different eyes. The red banners still hung from every building, but now she noticed how many people looked away when they passed. The bread queues moved with the patience of desperation rather than contentment. In the parks where Soviet monuments had replaced British heroes, she saw flowers left at night, small acts of remembrance that cleaning crews swept away each dawn. That evening, in her room at the Hotel Metropole, she wrote 2 articles. The first was everything Moscow wanted. 1 year after liberation, Britain embraces socialist future. She described grateful workers, thriving collective farms, successful re-education programs, and former capitalists who had seen the error of their ways. She quoted Harold Pemberton and Professor Thornby, captured the enthusiasm of party officials, painted a picture of a nation transformed and content. The second article began differently. The villages are empty now, their families scattered across Siberia like leaves in an autumn wind. In London, they have learned to smile with their mouths while their eyes hold winter. She wrote of the Whitfields' abandoned farm, of Mrs. Chen's careful lists, of James Morrison's quiet courage and terrible knowledge. She wrote of the children's toys in the weeds, and the flowers that appeared each night in defiance of official forgetting. She wrote of a proud people learning to survive by forgetting who they had been. The first article she placed in the official courier pouch bound for Moscow. The second she divided into coded segments and mailed to 3 different addresses in Stockholm addresses that James had whispered belonged to neutral journalists with American connections. On the train back to Moscow, watching the English countryside disappear in morning fog, Katerina opened her official notebook one last time. At the bottom of the page, beneath her quotes from smiling officials and grateful workers, she wrote a single line that would never see print in Pravda. History will remember not just who won, but what victory cost the ones who learned to call their conquerors liberators. The train clattered eastward through a Europe painted red, carrying both her lies and her truth toward uncertain futures. Behind them, London continued its careful pantomime of gratitude, while in hidden places, people like James Morrison kept different records and waited for the day when truth might again be safely spoken aloud. In Stockholm, 3 letters waited for collection, carrying words that might remind the watching world that liberation could be another word for loss, and that sometimes the most dangerous courage was simply the willingness to remember.